Here we go. Hey there.
Hi.
I just wanted to make sure that we could hear each other. Lovely listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Claire Martin, and I'm the Assistant Artistic Director of Sweet Tea Shakespeare. And I am thrilled and honored to be joined today by one of my dear friends and colleagues, Claire Whitman. Claire is a fellow playwright and a fellow lover of classical stories. She is a member of the Jugbroke Theater Company at Colonial Williamsburg, where she dresses up like an 18th century woman and lives an 18th century life and gives people who visit Williamsburg the chance to get a taste of what life might have been like right at the founding of our country. She is also a wonderful actress. I had the pleasure of meeting her in Stanton, Virginia this past fall. And when I wrote a play adaptation, she was kind enough to come in and play one of the biggest parts and blew it out of the water. And I just admire her very much. And so, Claire, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. You're very, very kind.
So are you in Richmond right
now? So I'm in Williamsburg.
Okay, you are.
Yep, I live about 5 minutes from the historic area where I work at CW.
Does that create tonal whiplash when you go in, like in the morning, when you go from wherever you live, which is contemporary, into that colonial setting?
It feels like there's sort of a slow fade, because especially right now, I need to coffee home before I go in. So sometimes I'll, be at a coffee shop in my full 18th century regalia, or on lunch breaks we'll go out to do a quick grocery run. But I think people in town are used to it, with the park being so close by.
I love it, and I'm so excited to be on the East Coast that I can visit Colonial Williamsburg, and more importantly, so that I can see, debonair waistcoat-wearing men and corset-wearing ladies in line at Starbucks. I really look forward to that experience. So Claire has her MFA from the Mary Baldwin program in Shakespeare and Performance, and she's also currently completing an MFA in playwriting from, remind me of your school?
Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia.
So she's well educated and well versed in classical stories, and I would just love to hear, Claire, how did you find your way into playwriting? And kind of, you're an actor, you're a playwright, you have dramaturgical skills, you of course work in a historical place. How do you describe yourself as an artist?
Oh, I scribble, I suppose. I think I started writing when I was quite young. It's funny that I work in Colonial Williamsburg now, because I think one of my first gateways to history, and for my love of research and sort of the context around the historical fiction stories I loved, was my Felicity American Girl doll. And so I loved that each of the American Girl dolls had a book that was called, Felicity's World or Samantha's World, that gave sort of a context and a deeper understanding of the world around the stories of these young women. And I think those were the books, along with, I don't know if you ever had the Dear America journals or the World Diaries.
Absolutely.
So I loved those so much, and I loved them first for just the stories of young women. And then I loved them all the more when I kept flipping through to the end and there was an extensive family tree and historical documentation. And so I think just understanding the world around the story is something that's always interested me and fascinated me. And when I was younger, I wrote a lot of poetry, and I wrote a novel in high school. I say I wrote a novel. It is scribblings, as I said. But I was very adamant that I was not going to write a play, because writing was my hobby and theater was what I was going to school for. And then I wrote a play, and I never stopped after that. And that's sort of how I've found my way to where I am. And I love more than anything that it's my job to write and tell stories and share these wonderful historical worlds that I think young women deserve to hear. And because I think it was the thing that was missing in some ways from my Colonial Williamsburg experience when I was very, very young, was just looking for a teenage girl in the park. And I think they're really doing extraordinary work, and I think thoughtful work, to try to make sure that the stories that we tell in the park are thoughtful and inclusive and unflinching, because the things that are terrible and sad are just as much a part of our country's history as the things that are joyful and loving.
Arguably more so.
And yes, so I think we are working to tell a complete history. And I very much appreciate that I get to be in the presence of my colleagues who teach me so much every day, and who just set an incredible example of equal parts artistry and humanity in the work that they create.
Oh, I love that. That's so beautiful. So, you are, I mean, you're just, I want to say qualified, but that's not even the right word. You are just like fully interdisciplinary. And I think it's one of the things that is sort of like most valuable and most like awe-inspiring in artists today, is artists who can put on lots of different hats and you know, step into lots of different worlds. But I'm curious, like, you know, you spend your work day literally surrounded by the 18th century. Do you feel a special affinity for that time period, or is there another time period that you especially love or have an affinity for?
I think particularly when I was in high school, had a particular fondness for sort of 18, such a broad scope, but I think I just quite enjoyed the progress, to watch the progress of sort of the mid-1800s coming up to the turn of the century. I was very curious about the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the scientific revolution going on at the time. So that was before the 18th century became my everyday. I think that was what I was most interested in, and where a lot of the books that I love took place. And so I think that's kind of where I was before, but I have a growing affinity as I learn more about the 18th century. I start to see how one century leads into another, and that I can roll that curiosity about progress back all the more.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I remember an interview once. So when I was in high school, my favorite TV show, and what is still the first 2 seasons are my favorite TV show, Downton Abbey, which is not without its problems, obviously. In fact, everything that we're going to be talking about today that is historical has its problems, just as we obviously do in America today. But the interview was with Julian Fellowes, the creator, and the man who almost single-handedly penned those first 2 seasons, like, himself. And that's like so rare, and for me treasured, when a TV show or some sort of long storytelling narrative on film is written by one person. It rarely happens, but when it does, or when the writer pool is limited, the story just ends up feeling so much more cohesive, and the arcs feel so much cleaner. And that's why I love the first 2 seasons of that show. And Julian Fellowes was saying that, you know, he likes the half century from like 1880 to like 1930, because it's only 50 years, which is just inside of many lifetimes. But like, the world changed. Like, the world just looked different on the back end than it did on the front. Like, it just was a different place. And I think one of the things that show did for me is it just woke me up to the sheer velocity with which technology started changing our world at the turn of the century, at the fin de siècle. Like, the fact that like toasters and phones and like all of these, like, not just electronics, like indoor lighting, but, you know, the fact that all of this was happening at once in like a blizzard of change and progress, and the fact that like World War I like exploded into that world of change. I had not realized that was that was the speed at which things were shifting during that time period. So I actually was never, I'm the complete opposite. I was never really interested in the 19th century. I found the Victorians incredibly weird and boring. And the Industrial Revolution, like, because I am really bad at science and machinery, I just sort of assumed that I would be bad at learning about it. And it wasn't until I watched Downton Abbey that I realized that, like, moments of technological advancement can make for, like, sublime storytelling. Watching the way different generations engage with the way that they do things having to shift, like, that is where really wonderful narrative tension comes from. And so, so I would love to talk with you a little bit about your storytelling, because you are a playwright, and I had the pleasure and honor of reading one of your plays a little bit earlier this year. So can you talk to us about The Female Quixote?
Certainly. So The Female Quixote is a novel from 1752 by Charlotte Lennox. And I love Charlotte Lennox for a great many reasons. Not only is this book beautiful, but what I like to say of Charlotte Lennox is that she came to bury Shakespeare, not to praise him. And one of the things that she was better known in her lifetime for was writing just an absolutely scathing criticism of Shakespeare in her book Shakespeare Illustrated.
Yep.
In which, so she was multilingual and quite well read, and so she took it upon herself to research the source material for many of Shakespeare's plays and investigate the female characters therein. And she was highly dissatisfied with the way that he transitioned these women from their context into his plays. So this book caused such a ruckus amongst those who thought he was great, which I guess was a lot of people, and to this day. So they showed up that she was in. I can't recall off the top of my head whether it was also one that she'd written, but they showed up specifically to boo her for having written this piece of criticism.
Sure.
So given that sort of her specialty was looking at the adaptation of source material into a play, I was almost hesitant to adapt her own novel for fear that she might rise up from the pages and tell me that I had just gotten it all wrong.
Sure.
But what I love about this novel is that when I first encountered it, I'd never heard of it.
Yeah.
And I love this era, and I love reading books that kind of fit into that, Jane Austen onward, but this is a little bit earlier, 1750s. It was before I ever began work at Colonial Williamsburg, and just something that I hadn't encountered before. And I was so captured by the notion of her protagonist, Arabella, who is a 17-year-old girl who, like her namesake Don Quixote, as he believes himself to be a knight, she believes herself to be at the center of one of the Gothic novels that were very popular in that era, and that we see sort of lovingly mocked in Northanger Abbey. And so I just fell in love with Arabella more than anything because we get to see her grow.
Yeah.
And that we meet her at a point in her life where she is very deeply flawed and very selfish, and also brilliant and charming and passionate. And I just felt she was so measured. She felt so real to me. And I loved watching her progress from sort of her youthful, imaginative self into growing into a woman. And I think the story is of its time. And of course, in Charlotte Lennox's time, the ending is that Arabella grows up and surrenders these ideals in favor of a marriage. So she trades sort of the flippant romance of a novel for the serious relationship of a marriage. And that's all lovely. But it also was not quite the story I was looking to tell in this instance, because in adapting this novel, I decided to create a play for young audiences and young actors.
Young female actors.
Yes. And I mean, there are parts that are written for male identifying actors. I'd like to write a version that also can be performed only by young women or non-binary of
Sure.
Your choice in that, because I think it's good to have casting options.
Yeah.
if, an all-girls school were to want to perform it or something to that effect.
My high school.
My high school was rather the opposite. We had so very few girls in my class. But I can't even quite tell you why the notion occurred to me to make this a theater for young audiences, or I guess I like to call it theater for a learning audience, because I don't think, you never have to stop learning. And I think plays that are meant to introduce new concepts, or in this case, sort of a new work of literature that we don't often see, that can be for all ages. But I was very keen to write something that girls in middle school in particular could perform, because I think there are not as many plays as there could be that are written specifically for that demographic.
Right.
And the story of Arabella learning to both hold on to the best things about her youth and also access a world as a grown-up was compelling and resounded with the way I know I felt during that time in my life. And I thought perhaps it might be true for others as well. But in part because it is written for young actors, and in part because I think no longer do we have to hold ourselves to the notion that to grow up and to sort of be fully received into society, that there needs to be a marriage at the end of the play. Arabella takes a slightly different path at the end, while still acknowledging, her romance, that it's not bad to want romance. It's not bad to want a marriage or a relationship, but also that it doesn't have to be right now. That's not how the play has to end, and that there's a lot of life ahead of her before she gets there. So that's sort of my latest endeavor. I really enjoyed writing it, and I thank you so much for reading it. And I hope that I can get some young actors in a room at some point to share their thoughts on it, because I don't think I can't perfectly capture how a 13-year-old girl feels anymore. So I'd like to hear from them as to where they see themselves in the play and how they like it.
That's marvelous. So. And just to sort of expand on that a little bit, the conceit of Claire's play is that it is girls in a school, young women who come together. One of them has written a play, which is the story of Arabella in Lennox's novel, and they decide to enact it together as a way of both passing the time and also kind of getting to know each other and getting to know themselves a little bit better. And what I think in her most brilliant stroke, Claire has given the girls of this school the idea that they are going to pass the baton of playing Arabella. And so the lead is not played by one person, and because of that, the ensemble of girls does not have one central protagonist, but rather the audience feels that we get to know an ensemble of women who come together to tell a story. And it is very, it's affirming of the kind of delight and magic that can happen when young women especially put their creative energies and imaginations together. And it's democratic in a way that women-run rooms often are. And it's deeply fun, and I really enjoyed writing it. Reading it, you wrote it. So thank you for sharing it with me. It was so fun to talk about. It was so fun to talk about with you for a whole host of reasons. You have a real awareness for an interest in enriching young actors' lives pedagogically, right? And giving them really chewy material that's interesting and deep, and in this case, multidimensional and meta-theatrical. And that can be really fun for young actors when they start to realize that there are plays that can acknowledge that there are plays happening in the plays, and just all of the circles that start to expand from that fallen pebble. And when we talked last, we had talked about how there are a disappointing scarcity of roles for young women that are under the age of the romantic marriageable ingenue, which is 16, and then roles for women who are over the age of about 35. There is this gulf in which there's this gulf for roles. And I think your play does a wonderful job of addressing the gulf for the younger actors. And what you and I have talked at length about is how do we create roles that are meaty and exciting, that go beyond being maternal, that go beyond being the queen who says 3 things and then dies in Hamlet. How do we create really rich offerings for women who are in middle age and beyond, where they can be something beyond the spinster or the mother. And I think that that is something that sort of that bonds us, and it's something that we sort of continue to come back to as we bounce ideas off each other. And I recently began writing a very, very radical adaptation of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which is a story that I love with characters that I hate, especially the female characters. Like, it's almost embarrassing to read. I remember reading it in high school and thinking, wow, this is a great plot, but I don't enjoy the characters. And I read it today, a decade later, and I'm like even more averse. But I think the story is so good, and the late 18th century, early 19th century is just so fascinating, that's kind of what's been keeping me going. And I have reframed the story, just as Claire did, as a story that's being told by women, about a lineage of women. And so, and the two characters who are the biggest parts in the play are this mother and this daughter. And the daughter character is meant to be played by a young actor, about 12 or 13, and the mother character is meant to be played by someone middle-aged. And so, when Claire and I started talking about female Quixote, we just talked about, like, how the next step in playwriting and in classical storytelling is investigating what the women are doing, that the men didn't care about writing. What are those women doing? The ones that are just out of sight, just off stage, just not quite there. What are they doing? And how can we tell their stories? So what is like what draws you into a story? Whether it's a play or a novel, like, what do you look for?
I have, I think, a twofold answer. I love language, and I don't mean to say, you had asked me this question when I was 18, I would have said, I like rich and complex language. If it's not Tom Stoppard, I don't want to read it, because I was, just terribly pretentious. But I think what tells me more than anything is language that tells me about a character.
Yeah.
No matter what form that language takes, I love to hear a character speak. I often joke that I want 10 seasons of world building and character setup before we get to the plot of any TV series. Because I quite like learning about characters and the minutiae of their lives. And I think thoughtful dialogue is one of the best ways to show and not tell. By choice of word, you can reveal so much. So I love plays that I feel like I am an active listener as I engage with it.
Yeah.
And it challenges me to learn alongside the characters.
Right.
And I appreciate more and more as visual storytelling. I think perhaps because it's something that I really have no concept of. I'm not a very visual person. And so when I see tremendous movement-based pieces or silent theater or anything to that effect, I'm fascinated by devised work and how visuals on a technical scale, the use of projections, I think is rather extraordinary in what people are able to create in that respect. So that's something that I feel like I have a burgeoning interest in, because it's something that is sort of outside the scope of my own brain. And I just really appreciate learning when I go to see a play.
That's so great. I mean, I agree with you about dialogue. And in fact, you had mentioned earlier in this conversation that you were writing poetry and that you wrote a novel in high school, which I don't, like, whatever you say, I'm sure it was more than just scribbles, because I know you. But that you were experimenting with other forms, right? Other media. And for me, I have always been a terrible writer at everything except dialogue. Dialogue is the only thing I feel like I've ever been able to write. And so even going way, way back to when I first became interested in writing, and I would write, I don't know if I can even classify them as short stories, but like shorter pieces that were technically in prose. My poetry has always been terrible, like laughably terrible. But my prose when I was younger, I was like, is this how you do it? And I was always so uninterested in the parts where people weren't talking. So it would be like, there would be really like interesting for something a 12-year-old could write, interesting dialogue. And then like the whole the whole train would just come screeching to a halt because I'd have like a paragraph of description about the countryside or whatever. It would be so obvious that my heart wasn't in it, that I just didn't care. And then as I became more and more interested in theater, and then of course, became a professional theater artist, and I became a director, then I became even less interested in writing that stuff because I wanted it to be, I wanted to fall under the purview of a director and a cast and a designer's control. I didn't want to make the decision for them because that felt autocratic. And so I wanted to leave the prose part up to other artists, up to a democratic and more like discovery-based process. And so, yeah, like writing plays was not, though that is my scribbling. It was never intentional. I never intended to be a playwright. And even today, I don't count myself as a playwright because I don't think I'm very good at it, but I do like it because of the challenge of telling entire narratives only through what people say, knowing full well that people rarely say what they mean. That challenge is like intellectually fascinating for me. Like that's what gets me excited. And I think what was so much fun about reading your play was that I got to not only experience who the girls were through their interactions with each other before and after they would step into the story, but I also got a sense of how you were engaging with Charlotte Lennox because of the way you were turning her novel, which is prose, into all dialogue. So there was a double engagement with how people talk and why we say things and why we don't say things. Those are the plays that are sort of most delicious to read and to discover. Yeah, so like we could talk about playwriting all day, and we have. And actually, the project that I sort of alluded to earlier, that I just want to give a shout out to you while you're here. Earlier this year, I wrote a 2-part adaptation of War and Peace, which I think is the first full stage adaptation that's ever been written in English, at least as far as I can tell. And Claire played Maria Bolkonskaya, one of the leads, and a character who has a really like slow burn arc, arguably like emerges from her cocoon way later than any of the other main characters, and is living in such a way where she is not even entitled to her voice, and she doesn't really realize she has one until she's finally put in a position where she has to make decisions and use authority for the first time in her life. And I would just love to hear you talk, Claire, like as a playwright who was being an actor in that instance. Do you find that your playwriting skill set informs the way that you are an actor and vice versa, or not?
I do think all these things feed into each other, if only because I think about, as a playwright, I try to be very thoughtful about my words. And so I know then when I'm an actor in a room that it's my responsibility to be just as thoughtful with the playwright's words as they were. And it's easy to do, and it's a wonderful piece, as was yours. But I think it's just a very rich gift to be let in on the vulnerability of saying, "Will you read my play?" Which is just, it's a terribly intimate thing to reveal. Here's the inner workings of my head. And in both the case, I would say, of War and Peace and Female Quixote, here is an enshrined work of literature.
Right.
And here is my usurper idea that I perhaps might have something to contribute to the conversation, which for me as sort of a shy person is feels like it's such a big step forward. But what I love about Maria is that I feel like I've had a slow burn of character development in my own life. And so it's just, she felt very recognizable to me. And I think something else that I consider as an actor from a playwright's perspective is that I think we put a little of ourselves into all of our characters.
Oh, yeah. Can confirm.
And so just being quite mindful of that, and that it's the most wonderful thing in the world to give constructive criticism, but I think we need to also make sure that it is constructive and compassionate criticism.
Yeah.
And that is the best way to both respect the humanity and artistry. I guess I said that earlier, and I think I like that phrase because I think we need to be considerate of both in every room we're in, and that no play or process is more important than the human beings creating it or the human beings watching it.
So true. Yeah. And I think like one of the things that we talked about with War and Peace and that you and I continue to talk about is the few stories we have in which there are multiple women who are named and have lives and identities. Those women often hate each other, often for like nonsensical and really like baseless reasons. And part of what I happen to love most about Jane Austen is the coterie of female characters that are in all of her books and the complexity of the relationships between them. They never just dislike each other. And even when they seem to just dislike each other, like Emma and Jane Fairfax, there are a lot of really deep-seated psychological reasons for it that the characters are denying, but the reader knows are there. And so what is still radical but shouldn't be is seeing lots of different kinds of women rather than despising each other on spec, like working together, getting to know each other, rubbing off on each other, encouraging each other to be better, and achieving goals in tandem and in collaboration. And the fact that we don't have as many stories like that as we should is just, I think, yet another side effect of the sort of the patriarchy that is so entrenched even in the arts. And so what's been really exciting for me as I've talked to you and as I've started to like read more plays as I've gotten older, especially plays by women and women playwrights of color, has been the realization that like finally there is a new wave of proliferation of narratives in which there are lots of women who are very different from each other, and they are they find their way to each other, and they hold thumbs, and they face the darkness as one, even when they acknowledge that they will never be alike. So female Quixote and your spin on it with a bunch of girls coming together to support their friend, the playwright, and to tell a story, in a universal kind of unilateral way, which is theater, is really powerful because we get to see the young girls work together. And we get to see that when they put their efforts to one goal, what they create is so much bigger than the sum of its parts. So I'm just going to take a brief moment here and just like thank our sponsors today. All of our incredible patrons on Patreon. Thank you so much for supporting Sweet Tea Shakespeare and for allowing us to produce this podcast, and so I can have wonderful conversations like this. And I'd also like to thank the Arts Council of Fayetteville and Cumberland County. We are deeply appreciative of the fact that you endow the arts community with support, and that you lift us up and you allow us to lift up the voices of artists. We're deeply appreciative. Even in these uncertain COVID times, I'm so happy that we have the opportunity to still engage with art and still ask hard questions and have enriching conversations. So thank you for everything you do that makes this possible. Claire, we have a beautiful Google document that we have been curating for the past week or so. This document I cannot take any credit for. It was Claire's idea. It was her like brilliant seed that she planted, and we've just kind of been growing this plant for about 10 days. I would love, Claire, for you to first of all just describe what it is, and what you and I are going to be talking about, and then I think I'll have you read the introduction.
Most certainly. So when thinking about this genre that we love of period pieces and classical adaptations, it's really important to acknowledge that this genre is so exclusive and has been so exclusive in the people that it allows to create it and present it, And so I wanted to not just talk about, my very white room with a view experience, and make sure that other voices are taking prominence in this conversation, and that writers who are taking classical storytelling beyond the box that it's in now are unequivocally women and non-binary playwrights of color. And so we would like to share some really wonderful plays that we love that fit in this period genre category that are created by members of marginalized communities. But before we do, I just wanted to sort of speak to our place as two white women discussing this.
Yeah.
And so the first thing I want to say is that I can never claim any expertise in intersectionality, because I have an endless litany of times that I have failed actively and passively to be anti-racist, especially when it comes to my life in the arts. I have benefited endlessly from being an upper middle class white girl, more than anything because I have chosen not to speak up when I had the responsibility to do so. Instead, accepting the privileges that came with being silent and complacent and a good girl who didn't want to rock the boat. And that makes me the worst sort of coward, and I am properly ashamed for that. So that's the thing I have expertise in, is the times when I have failed. But I hope that others can learn from my mistakes and do less harm than I have as they embark on their personal artistic journeys. So one thing that I would like to say to young white women in the theater is that we uphold what we will not protest.
Yes.
When we trade the dignity and brilliance and the very lives of marginalized communities for our own comfort, or because we're trying to follow the rules or the systems that were invented to oppress us and others, we become instruments of that oppression, even when we think that we're not actively doing harm. So I'd like to invite to engage in self-examination and consider this, that if anyone has ever told you that to be good is to be quiet, especially when it comes to fighting against systemic societal injustices, they were wrong.
Yeah. You
have important, unique, and loud voices, but they are most powerful and most loving and most good when they are used to uplift others. So, in brief, I am not an expert on intersectionality, but rather someone who needs at every juncture to confront her own racism and other biases in the interest of intersectionality. But I am delighted to proclaim that as far as intersectional feminism is concerned, that it is vital. It is vital ethically speaking, and it's also our greatest gift artistically speaking.
Yes.
We create our best work when we do so thoughtfully, inclusively, and passionately. And I think it's an honor to be anti-racist. We should be so grateful and so humbled and joyful for the opportunities we have to magnify the message that Black lives matter, that Black stories matter. And furthermore, Black lives and stories are glorious and necessary and a gift.
Yeah.
So thank you for listening. And ultimately, all I hope to do today is share some resources and amplify some voices that have been very impactful to me, and then also to share some wonderful plays that are created by Black, Indigenous, and other theater makers of color. So we've created a little list. Basically, we've been saying that this is, if you liked X, you'll love Y. But before we get there, we want to say that, first of all, we should cast people of color in period pieces full stop.
Yes. All the time.
And we should have Lizzie Bennet's and Juliet's played by Black and Indigenous actors. We should accept no lesser Much Ado than the one starring Danielle Brooks. But as we observe this color conscious casting, we also need to be listening to the thoughts and feelings and experiences of these actors of color. So I'd like
not represented in these plays. No matter how consciously we cast, the plays were not written to be formed by them. And so it is not their authentic experiences that we are portraying. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that those stories now are getting told alongside the original stories that we consider classical.
So to take a closer investigation of that, I recommend Heathcliff Saunders' recent article, What I Think About When I Hear That Broadway is Racist. in which he discusses his experiences as a Black musical theater writer and actor, and discusses the difference between inclusive casting of an imagined world and the one.
Yeah.
So perhaps at some point we could put a link in a description so that this could be easily accessed.
Absolutely.
So what I think about when I hear that Broadway is racist by Heathcliff Saunders. So yes, we should cast actors of color in our period pieces, full stop. Yes, and we should also put adaptations of classical works in the hands of marginalized communities, while also acknowledging how the establishment of a fixed white Western male cisgender canon has and will continue to harm those communities if we are not thoughtful and careful in the way that we approach them.
Yep.
And then for an example of how this can be accomplished and why it makes such a difference, I highly recommend another article, which is Jane Austen and the Persistent Failure of the White Imagination, written by Aisha Matu and Noura Maznavi. It's really excellent and thoughtful scholarship on all fronts about Jane Austen, about sort of the period piece industry, and about the wonderful ways that this can be broken open and become a greater amalgamation of cultures. And so furthermore, yes, and we can and should produce all the classically inspired period piece, historical heightened language plays by women and non-binary playwrights of color. And we'd like to just share some from our list that we've compiled so that if you're thinking about curating your season, you have a resource to say, well, I'd really like to do a period piece, but all of those are written by white men, aren't they? Well, no, they most certainly
not. They are not.
You know, we'd like to give some examples of pieces that might be popular in seasons and other options if you're looking for a more inclusive written season. So the first one that I have on the list is Peter and the Starcatcher.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good play. It's sort of a magical realism Victorian look at the Peter Pan story. But if you liked Peter and the Starcatcher, you will love Men on Boats by Jacqueline Bacchus. So similar in that it involves devised work. It takes place in a similar time period. It's historically derived. It contains no cisgendered men and many boats. So
I'm so excited to read it. That's the only thing I know about it, is that there's no men and lots of boats, and I can't tell you how excited I am. Great qualifications.
So that, indeed. So if you are looking to a piece, my example on the list right now is Carousel by Rodgers and Hammerstein. Yeah. If you're looking for a sort of sweeping romantic period piece musical, we invite you to consider Gun and Powder by Angelica Cherie with music by Ross Baum. It was recently produced at Signature Theater. And I think what made me really think about it in combination with Carousel is if the thing that you think you're looking for in something like Carousel is strong female characters, which arguably Julie and Carrie do have lovely songs, and they have interesting arcs until everything gets strange in Act 2. If that's what you're searching for, look no further than Gun and Powder. This is what you could put this in place of your Oklahoma or your Music Man or My Fair Lady. Any of those Golden Age period pieces, this is your choice. So it is the story of two young Black women who robbed banks and sort of their experiences with, on occasion, passing for white and what that meant in its time period in the 1890s. And about the power of these sisters' bond and their love for their mother. And I think it's just really marvelous. And I'm devastated I didn't get to see it in person, though I have consumed every bit of media surrounding it. And really hope that it will become, it should go to Broadway, but become a staple in the same way that these other period piece musicals are.
Fantastic.
And then another musical. If you liked Assassins by John Weidman and Stephen Sondheim, you will love Ambition by Kayla Mashing Garvin, which is about American female serial killers.
Yes, it is.
And the entire soundtrack is available on Bandcamp, and we can make sure that in the future we've got a link to that as well. And I just think it's incredibly clever and provocative. And I'd also like to shout out her adaptation House of Mirth, which is an adaptation of the Edith Wharton novel. I love Edith Wharton. And this is available on NPX. if you wanted to take a look at it. And then I think the last on my half of the list is if you're looking to produce anything by Kaufman and Hart, those sort of 30s fast-paced comedies, we recommend By the Way, Meet Vera Stark by Lynn Nottage, which also takes place in the 30s, involving all the glitz and glamour of old Hollywood, but centers on the story of a young Black woman who becomes a movie star.
I love it. Lynn Nottage is incredible, and I'm about to talk about another one of her plays, just because she is so kind of iconic. So if you're like me, one of the things that you love about period pieces is the costumes. What are they wearing, and how fancy are the outfits? And even though Sarah Ruhl's brilliant play In the Next Room, or the Vibrator play, is not actually about clothing, one of the sort of conceits of the play is this constant dressing and undressing as the female patients come in and out of the doctor's house. Of course, In the Next Room is a play about the treatment of inducing orgasms in women that was given by doctors in the late Victorian era as a way of decreasing their quote-unquote hysteria. And it's a play that takes a really hard look at female sexuality and motherhood, all through this kind of like late Victorian lens. It's a beautiful play, and if you like it, then I high-key recommend Intimate Apparel, which is also by Lynn Nottage. We're not quite the same era. We're about 20 years later. We're right in 1905, so right at the turn of the century. But it is the story of an African-American woman who comes to New York with hopes of being a seamstress, and in the same way that In the Next Room takes a really hard look at like femininity and sexuality in the context of a very repressed and repressive era, Intimate Apparel does the same. And both plays invite just fantastic costume design, so it's hard to go wrong. And then we have Five Women Wearing the Same Dress by Alan Ball. You talk about this one, but these two plays, I love these plays.
Well, I understand. I understand the appeal of a play like Five Women Wearing the Same Dress, in that there are 5 whole women in it. But I think we can do a little bit better. It was not a period piece when it was written, but I think we can firmly classify sort of the 1980s world now as being quite dated. But if you're looking for a play with lots of women, we recommend Schoolgirls, or the African Mean Girls play by Jocelyn Bio. And one of the things I love the most about this play is that the characters are teenagers. There are some of their teachers who are involved, as in this school for girls, but all of our primary characters are in their early mid-teens. And I think that comes back to what we were talking about earlier about plays in which young actors can play roles that are their age. And I think this is just an extraordinary look at that, and a look at the Miss Universe pageant in the 80s and the effects that racism and colorism has on these young schoolgirls as they observe the beauty standards of this pageant and seek out to find the beauty in themselves and in each other.
And just to follow up on that, it's also very funny. Like, there's a reason why it alludes to Mean Girls in the title. It's genuinely funny. I had the pleasure of seeing a production of it at Portland Center Stage here in my hometown just this past year. Like, it was provocative, and it was deeply, sort of, it made me think in a way that I rarely do about the lives of young women specifically in Africa, because we never get stories that are told about what it was like in the sort of late 20th century for people who were living in Africa, as opposed to perhaps Black people that were living in the United States. But I also at the same time laughed out loud several times throughout the production. It's a very funny play, and so there's a lot of meat for young actors, young Black actors to chew on, because they get to flex their tragic muscles, their dramatic muscles, but also their comic ones as well. So I'm going to go next to a real classic, in the sense of like the old school definition of a classic, Mary Zimmerman's The Odyssey, which she has directed many times. The production that I am sort of familiar with came to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in 2017. but she has done it many places and many times. And it is her kind of brilliant, resplendent, spectacular interpretation of Homer's ancient tale. And it's a really wonderful play. And if you like it, and if you like the big sprawling narrative of the Odyssey, then I recommend Anonymous by Naomi Iizuka. And that's Anon, and then in parentheses, Ymous. And the reason why I called that is because the main character is named Anon, which alludes not only to the Odyssey and Odysseus's sneaky, like, I'm no one, I have no name, his plot on the island of the Cyclops, but also the play follows a young refugee named Anon in the United States who is searching for not only his mother, but his identity that has been stripped from him. And the whole play is just a beautiful and poetic lyrical meditation on the erasure of identity and culture that white America imposes on refugees from all over the world, but especially from third world nations and nations that are not white the way America is white. So it's a beautiful play. There are actually roles for many different ages in it. The main character could be quite young. I read Anon as like 20, but you could play him at a couple of different ages. But the character of his mother is, who of course is the Penelope figure. She is a major character, and that is a wonderful part for an older woman of color. So recommend Anonymous. Also, another sort of staple in the white classical period piece canon is Cloud 9 by Carol Churchill. I have deep, abiding love for Carol Churchill. I did a whole course in college, undergrad, where we read almost her entire canon in the course of a semester, and we learned about the art of dramaturgy through her work. She's brilliant, and we have nothing but respect for her in this house. And if you like her plays, like Cloud 9, which is this play, it's like a quasi-Victorian time-traveling epic. It starts in the colonies in the Victorian era, and all of the characters are played by actors who have different identities as a way of like commenting on the way that the British Empire enforced its ideals upon people to the point where they actually stopped wanting to be themselves and wanting to be something else. And then it takes whatever cast is in Act 1 in this Victorian colony, those same actors are shuffled around and then placed in the 1970s. And they play totally different characters, but some of the same issues that they are encountering and debating regarding imperialism and colonialism and the lasting effects of it, those conversations carry across the two acts. So it's a wild play. It's brilliant, and if you like it, then I cannot recommend enough Mary Seacole by Jackie Sibley's Drury, which is amazingly, even though seems so niche, it is also a Victorian time-traveling epic that follows, in the past, follows the life of the very real and very inspiring Mary Seacole, who was a Black and Jamaican mixed-race woman living in the mid-19th century, who was a nurse and a businesswoman, and who opened a hotel in which she sort of supported soldiers during the Crimean War. She lived for about 80 years and accomplished more than what many people do across many lifetimes. So Drury's play not only investigates that woman, who she really was, and how she moved through the world, but it also juxtaposes the Mary Seacole story with the story of sort of contemporary Black women and encountering the health system of America today, and the insufficiency of our healthcare in the same way that Mary Seacole was trying to redress insufficient health services for soldiers in the 19th century. So, big time traveling epic that gets you across 2 centuries. Recommend Mary Seacole. All right, and so this one I love. Claire made a note here, and it's just making me giggle. So, if you like Little Women, which I'm sure many of you do, there are many adaptations. We would like to encourage you to look at Civil War narratives that actually are a little bit more clear-sighted about the people who were living through that time, especially the lives of Black people, and both in the North and the South. And so one of the plays that I'd like to recommend is Confederates by Dominique Morisseau, which, similarly to Mary C. Cole, juxtaposes the experiences of a Black woman living during the Civil War era and the life of a contemporary Black female professor in sort of dealing with the contemporary forest of academia in America. But it is, it's much more, it has a lot more clarity about the realities of what the Civil War was being fought for and how it affected the lives of Black Americans. And the other one that I cannot recommend enough is Father Comes Home from the Wars by Susan Laurie Parks, which is not only a sprawling and beautiful epic about the Civil War, but it is also a retelling of the Odyssey. So if you're an Odyssey fan and you, I don't know, have some spare Union soldier costumes lying around your costume shop, we recommend Father Comes Home from the Wars. Susan Laurie Parks is an extraordinary writer. I was fortunate enough to play a part in an ensemble of her 365 plays, 365 days when I was an undergrad. And her writing she has such a deft touch. I have never met someone who can make me feel so much from so few words. And as someone who often talks too much, I have just enduring respect for her ability to convey oceans of story in 5 or 6 lines of dialogue. Moving on to the musical Spring Awakening. I don't know my musicals as well as Claire, but I do know Spring Awakening. It's very famous. And there are some great jams in it and some really provocative sort of concepts that come up in that musical. And if you enjoy it, I would high-key recommend Cambodian Rock Band by Lauren Yee. So Cambodian Rock Band is it is a musical, and it's also a visceral take on Pol Pot's takeover in Cambodia in the 70s, a period of history that I only faintly had heard of through my education. It's not something, it was not a part of my pedagogy as I was growing up. So I was a pretty bad audience member because I was constantly looking in my program. But Cambodian Rock Band is this brilliant story that moves back and forth through time. And ultimately it follows a character who starts the play as the father of a young woman who is in Cambodia, present day, working on civil rights issues. And she doesn't really know him, and she doesn't know why he's so against her being there and against her doing her work. And as the play progresses, you find out that her father actually lived through Pol Pot's takeover and was a prisoner who was just sort of tortured during that time, and saw firsthand the carnage and the destruction that was wreaked in Cambodia. And her father also was in a band, and this play is littered. The whole story is littered with live musical performances by a band that plays rock music from the 70s, and gives you this whole taste of Cambodian life in the 70s before the takeover, and the way that culture and art was flourishing. And it just makes for this sort of searing investigation of the cost, the cost of human greed and violence, and also the way that the arts, specifically music, can be something that gets us through. And it's also, at the end of the day, just sort of a beautiful story about a father and a daughter coming to understand each other in a new way and coming to love each other even more deeply because of the trauma that they have both been through. So Cambodian Rock Band, high-key recommend. Also, the songs are jams. You're going to want to download all of them after you see the show. And then finally, I have The Grapes of Wrath, which of course is a very famous novel by Steinbeck, and deservedly so. It is a beautiful story and a really important portrait of what life was like in America during the Great Depression, and especially as that intersected with the Dust Bowl. Frank Galati has a wonderful play adaptation of it that was recently done at the American Shakespeare Festival. And if you enjoyed The Grapes of Wrath, I don't know, I say enjoy. If you are captivated by The Grapes of Wrath, because it's not a very happy story, but if you're interested in the 1930s and you're interested in really dramatic and moving portraits of human suffering and human endurance, then I would like to recommend A Nanking Winter by Marjorie Chan. which is probably one of the hardest plays I've ever had to read. I've never seen it, but it is a it is a portrait of a writer who is trying to write a book, an Asian American author, and she's trying to write a book about the Nanking Massacre, that was that sort of resulted in the rapes of thousands of women during the 1930s, in the course of the sort of like imperialistic wars that were happening between China and Japan. It's a very difficult play, and yet it is, like, at the same time, it is lyrical and lovely and somehow like hopeful, or at least it allows space for hope to live in at the end. And it just illuminates a moment of history that, again, I did not know anything about before I read the play. And so I high-key recommend it, but just know going in A Nanking Winter, you are in for many, many tears. Possibly cathartic, but many tears. So that is where our list is at currently, but Claire and I are hoping that we just can continue to develop it moving forward.
And I think one of the things that we're thinking about as we compose this is that it could be a useful lineup for educational institutions. In that, I think colleges and community theaters and high schools can do a lot to promote works that falls outside of sort of the mainstream theatrical canon as it currently stands. Because, and forgive me, I'll read this just because I wrote it down, but if we share a truly inclusive library of plays with our students and encourage them to take joy in promoting historically underrepresented voices, they will expect and demand it from the professional market as well. So if we can foster these notions in the next generation of theater goers, it will become ubiquitous. Yep. So that's our responsibility as educators, is to ensure not only that our students are exposed to a truly inclusive swath of plays, but also share the joy that comes from that and why it is so vitally important and why they need to continue to ask for it and uplift it and promote it for the rest of their lives.
Yep. Fantastic. Well, I mean, Claire and I had more fun than we can tell you putting this list together. And now I have all these plays I want to read. You have all these plays you want to read. And that is like the greatest feeling, that we are not only, that we may not only like lift up the voices of playwrights and artists and storytellers that we wouldn't ordinarily hear, but also that in the process we become more educated and enriched, and we become more aware of the world in which we live and the intricacies of politics and culture in the press. Because art, at the end of the day, well-made art, well-made stories, they allow us to make the world better. The well-made thing goes both ways. So that is our list, and we are going to, in the show notes for this episode, we're going to paste not only the list itself, but also all of the links that we mentioned and all of the articles. And we encourage you, we exhort you to find your way to these lists and to explore these plays and these articles, and the brilliance and wisdom and insight of people who have experienced marginalization and experienced human disparity in a way that Claire and I have not. Yeah, thank you so much for listening and for sort of joining us on that journey. We are very pleased that we got to go on it, and we're so pleased that the journey continues. So, Claire, I think before we sort of step away and close out for the day, I think I will just ask you, like, what is a story that you feel like you will always be able to come back to? What story in your life does not cease to, like, give to you?
That's the hardest question you could possibly ask me.
Well, I saved it for last.
Yes. I think this perhaps steps out a little bit beyond the stories that we've been talking about today, in that it's not based on a book or from a sort of classical canon, but the story of my grandmother is one that I return to and really specifically the story of my grandmother and her sister, who lived in Latvia during the 1940s and had to flee over the mountains as the Russians invaded, and ultimately came to Ohio in the United States. And I love my grandmother so much, and I love the relationship between her and her sister. I've never had a sister, but I've had that extraordinary example all my life. And I think that was one of my first representations of the power of female friendship and of selflessly asking what we can do for each other to promote each other's joy. And so that's, I don't know if it's ever a story that I would put pen to paper for, but I think it has rather subconsciously appeared in everything I've written.
That's so lovely.
Certainly. What I would ask you the same question.
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I'm going to have anything that is as emotionally resonant as that. A story that I can always come back to. You know, it is so simplistic, but it also is so important to me, is the story of Emma Woodhouse in Jane Austen's Emma. Like, it's, I think that her growth and development, her flaws, her deep-seated sense of inferiority, and the fact that it manifests as an appearance of superiority, and that she is just such a mess of contradiction, and yet at the end of the day, she has this fast brain, this big heart, and this profound desire to connect, right? It is endlessly inspiring for me, that Austen made a heroine of someone who is so messy and so flawed. It gives me hope in myself that when I see the flaws and when the sense of insecurity rises, and the feeling that I will never be good enough and I will never do enough and that I am just failing at every turn, I remember, like, no, Jane Austen had that person and she made her the heroine. And her journey was not ended when she fell in love. Her journey did not conclude with romance. Her journey concluded with a sincere apology to someone that she had hurt, and a recognition that she needs to grow up and do better, and weaponize her privilege for other people as opposed to weaponizing it against them. So it is a story with holes. It is a story with its own faults and flaws, but it is a story I will always come back to because it gives me hope that everyone can be better, and that it is when we have a community of people around us who love us and tell us when we're wrong, that that's a gift. That being told that we're wrong is a gift because it gives us the opportunity to do better next time. So Emma is my answer. Well, Claire, thank you so much for spending the time with me today. It's been such a joy talking with you. I'm just honored, and with that, I think I'm going to have our little jingle play us out, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Bye.